Hello everyone, I'm Kaboda. Today we're going to be discussing the claims from the Russian camp that Ukraine is in need of denazification, that Ukraine's Nazi problem is justification for the invasion and its subsequent death and destruction. We're going to find out whether this is a legitimate justification or whether it is just Russian propaganda making an issue to seem much more damning than it is to defend the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Before anything else, it is important that we establish the context before moving on. Ukraine's issue with Nazism started in the Second World War, and therefore it's important to set the stage. From 1932 to 1933, Ukraine suffered a famine from the Soviet policies of rapid industrialisation and collectivisation of agriculture, killing between 3.5 million and 5 million Ukrainians, around 13% of the entire population of Ukraine at the time, with starvation so rampant that around 2,500 official convictions in this time period took place for cannibalism, with many more likely going unconvicted or facing punishment by the public. There is contention on whether or not Holodomor was a genocide or simply bad planning by the Soviets that led to it happening by accident. There is no international consensus that it was in fact an intended genocide of Ukrainians. And while I'm not going to comment on whether or not it was, it is important to note that Ukraine in this period has suffered heavily under the Soviet leadership, be it by the negligence or the lack of foresight, or on purpose as an act of genocide. The Ukrainian people have had good justification to lay the blame at the feet of their Soviet rulers at this time, whom had been in power for only 10 years at this point, following the Ukrainian People's Republic being defeated by the Soviet Union in the Ukrainian-Soviet War. This is important therefore to note, that in the few decades prior to the Second World War that Ukraine has been taken by the Soviet Union and then suffered under its rule. It was not a rosy situation, and therefore this lays an understandable foundation for how much discontent many Ukrainians would have held for the Soviet Union following Holodomor. Promotion of a new Soviet identity instead of Ukrainian arose. Official pressure on Ukrainians to use the Russian language grew more intensely. The families who lost loved ones to Holodomor feared hunger and further repressions for the rest of their lives. And this fear was pressed onto future generations of Ukrainians. The artificial famine was not, however, the only way the Soviet Union caused suffering for Ukrainians in the 1930s. There was also the Great Terror, or also known as the Purges understanding. While the purges were Soviet-wide, the Ukrainian people had their fair share of suffering under the purges too, with mass graves being dug up to this day from that very era. The purges under Stalin were a policy of sending millions of quote-unquote enemies of the people to prison camps, as well as summary executions, and many being found to be corroborated by the NKVD to reduce any opposition to Stalin's rule, such as supporters of Trotsky or any other branch of political alignment. This led to a culture of suspicion and paranoia, with many reporting others for fallacious claims of being enemies of the people, and the NKVD enforcing this via summary executions and gulag sentences. 100,000 Communist Party members were shot, as well as half of the military high command. This played a large role in the great success of the German offensives against the Soviets during the early stages of Operation Barbarossa, due to how many experienced leaders were lost. It was not only government officials that suffered, however, as among the Soviet population, 650,000 people were shot between 1936 and 1938, as well as 1 million people being imprisoned. A large percentage of these were not supporters of Stalin's competitors, but simply people who laid criticism at the Soviet government in general, and many whom were falsely accused. Ukrainians were specifically targeted during the famine period with the growing discontent towards the Soviet Union that it caused, with 200,000 arrests between 1932 and 1933 connected to the Great Terror. In all, around 500,000 faced arrest between 1932 and 1936, and hundreds of thousands were labelled as class enemies. After analysing the history in Ukraine during the 1930s, it then becomes clear that this period of Soviet rule caused widespread suffering for the average Ukrainian, and would have shaped a perspective in Ukraine that the Soviets to many were bad for Ukraine, and to many Ukrainians they were viewed as occupiers of their land. Now that we understand the context of Ukraine's situation leading up to the war, we are well equipped to make a better informed judgment on what happened in Ukraine during the Second World War and why many Ukrainians viewed the Soviets as their enemy. We move forward to the Second World War with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, ceding the Baltic states, but more importantly to this topic, parts of Poland-controlled West Ukraine into the Soviet Union. Here is where we begin to discuss the OUN, the Organisation of Ukrainian Nationalists, with their slogan, Ukraine for Ukrainians, whom at this point had allegedly taken part in assassination attempts and other violent means to bring around an independent Ukraine, including part of Ukraine controlled at the time by Poland. Following the pact between the Soviets and Germans that gave the Soviets the entirety of Ukrainian land, many Ukrainian nationalists were deported or executed by the NKVD. In 1940, a split occurred in the OUN. There was the more moderate group, the OUN-M, and there was the more radical wing, the OUN-B. The OUN-B was led by Stepan Bandera. Around this time, in German-occupied Poland, two pro-German units were set up, the Nachtigall Battalion and the Roland Battalion. This is important to note for later, for these units would be part of events that would be cemented in Ukrainian history. Following this, Operation Barbarossa was launched by Germany against the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941. Within around a week, German forces reached the western Ukrainian city of Lviv, where they would discover thousands of slaughtered Polish and Ukrainian political prisoners by the retreating Soviets. As well as these German forces in Lviv was the Roland Battalion and the infamous Stepan Bandera, despite the Germans not allowing him permission to go to Ukraine. It is important to note that in Lviv, Germans began their brutality against Jews, with the Roland Battalion taking part almost immediately after their arrival. After entering Lviv, Bandera made the following statement. The founding of the Ukrainian state for which the whole generations of the best sons of Ukraine laid down their lives. The newly established Ukrainian state will collaborate closely with the National Socialist Greater Germany, which under the direction of its leader Adolf Hitler is creating a new order in Europe to free itself from Moscow's occupation. It was clear that Bandera viewed the Germans as a means to free Ukraine from Soviet occupation, and this plan was based off the situation in Yugoslavia where Croatia was declared independent, despite it being very much under heavy German influence and not truly independent. Stepan wished to achieve that same perceived independence for Ukraine as he perceived the Croatian independence to be successful. This failed, however, as the Germans refused this and imprisoned Bandera, where he would remain for the rest of the war. What followed after his arrest was Ukraine being largely occupied by Germany, the German-occupied Polish government, and Romania. It was not the case that all nationalist Ukrainians were in favour of the treatment of Jews, or the German occupation in general. However, many elements of the nationalists were undeniably anti-Semitic and happily collaborated with the Germans, and therefore partook in many of the pogroms that took place in Ukraine against the Jewish population. The German-organised Roland and Nachtigall Battalion were pulled back to Germany and turned into the Achungsmannschaft Battalion 201. The group was sent to fight partisans in Belarus. After a year when the group's service expired, any that refused were sent to internment. However, many of those that would manage to escape, with many of those who fled the Germans going on to join the UPA, also known as the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. The UPA fought against all sides in the war, including the Polish authorities, Nazis and the Soviets. The UPA used a variation of the Ukrainian flag with the red and black, as you have probably seen if you've been following Ukraine for some time. The colours of the flag symbolise the red Ukrainian blood spilled on the black Ukrainian soil, and is commonly used in Ukraine with the symbolism of Ukrainians fighting for Ukraine, and is still popular with nationalist groups to this day. The UPA would even go on to resist past the end of the Second World War, as the Soviets to many Ukrainians were still an occupying, oppressive force, and many Ukrainians still wanted an independent Ukraine without being ruled by the Soviets or the Germans. As well as the Achungsmannschaft Battalion 201, many other units that Germany worked with ended up being supplied with German uniforms and equipment. Germany utilised the Ukrainian frustration with the Soviets to wage war against the Soviets with Ukrainian soldiers in the 14th SS Volunteer Division, Galicia. All Ukrainian units fighting under German support and armament ended up being named as the Ukrainian Liberation Army, and eventually the Germans did recognise Ukrainian independence, but in 1945, March, long after Germany had lost all control of Ukraine, again trying to shore up Ukrainian resistance against the Soviet Union, which they knew there was such a desire for in Ukraine. There were also a number of Ukrainian groups that fought for the Soviets to remove the Germans under the banner of the Russian Liberation Army. 4.5 million Ukrainians ended up serving in the Red Army or served as partisans behind German lines, while the vast majority of Ukrainians had to suffer through the war as well as the back and forth between the Soviets and Germans. While Germany had some support at the beginning of their occupation, it did become clear to the vast majority of the civilian populace in Ukraine that they were just another nation there to occupy their land. Thousands of Ukrainians were hung or shot for partisan activity, with 250 villages and their populace deliberately annihilated to make an example and keep the others in line, as well as tens of thousands of deaths from starvation in Kiev and Kharkiv. The Germans finally enacted a policy of scorched earth, burning and stealing and destroying anything they left behind on their retreat out of Ukraine. Ukraine would spend the majority of the early 20th century suffering at the hands of foreign nations. While German collaboration was not the majority of Ukrainians, it did happen, as it did in all Nazi-occupied states. Anti-Semitism was common in this period of time in Europe, and even among the Soviets, and that combined with a strong sentiment of Soviet oppression made it easy for the Germans to utilise radical elements of Ukrainian nationalists in that period, who believed that they would somehow bring around an independent Ukraine by fighting for the Germans. They were, of course, wrong, and that never happened until the fall of the USSR. Unfortunately, within modern Ukraine are nationalist groups who view the largest threat to their independence to be Russia, and then hark back to historical figures such as Bandera and the UPA and the OUN. Those who fought the Soviets regardless of actions that stained their reputation were held as heroes among those who view Russia as the greatest threat to Ukraine. Whether it be because they align with their views, are ignorant to their evils, or simply because they believe freeing Ukraine made them vindicated for their evils. Moving on from the Ukrainian, Soviet and Nazi collaborators, freedom fighters and figures that became cemented in Ukraine's history, it's important to understand briefly what life was like for the average Ukrainian in this time, and how information would have also been controlled. Now, it's known that the German treatment of Jews was publicly underplayed, such as concentration camps that wouldn't be known until the Red Army was pushing through Poland, discovering the first camp in 1944. It was not until 1945 that concentration camps began to be actually shown in the media, newspapers and tabloids around the world. The Germans were viewed as evil much more because of their rampant wars of expansion across Europe to occupy nations, something that a Ukrainian was already too familiar with under the Soviets. Keeping this in mind, Ukrainian access to information in the 1930s to 1940s is important to note in the fact that it is vastly different than today. During this era, it was much easier to brainwash populations and hide atrocities. It was much more common under the Soviet and Nazi rule, even further with their government-controlled media. This means that Ukrainians were often not told the truth, but what their occupier wanted them to hear. Word of mouth only goes so far. So it's important to note that it was not all known, much like many German soldiers would be unaware of many of Germany's evils during the Second World War. And however, this does not excuse the collaborators that were more radical and anti-Semitic by any means. Being wrong out of ignorance to the truth is not an excuse, but it is relevant to establishing the general intent by Ukrainians who fought for whoever promised their liberty. It's also worth noting that Ukraine was not a wealthy nation following the famine and wars which failed to preserve Ukraine as an independent state. Ukraine was a land of peasantry, and somewhat comparable to Russia in this time also. While Ukraine was home to great artists and thinkers, it was a troubled, poor nation. Finally, it's worth to remember that in the modern era, with a plethora of information at the tip of our fingers, we forget that in history this was not always the case. That it is much easier for governments to fool their people into fighting against their own best interests when they control the media, and there's less access to public information. With this established, however, it is time to move on from the Second World War now that we've assessed the situation of Ukrainian historical collaborators and understand how Ukraine's modern ideology would be shaped by the events that took place during this war. What followed the Second World War was around 5 decades of Soviet rule over the Ukrainian people. While there was a push by the Soviet government to create an image of Ukraine and Russia as brother states to keep the Union stable, there would always be memories and records of the great horrors that Ukraine endured under the Soviets. Eventually, however, this rule would fall. as Ukraine held a referendum on independence on the 1st of December 1991, which would be followed by the fall of the Soviet Union less than a month later on the 26th of that very same month. The results of the referendum are worth noting, with every region of the country of Ukraine voting a majority in favour of an independent Ukraine over remaining in the Soviet Union, with east of Ukraine voting around 80% in favour of this move despite being renowned for its much more Russian-linked populace, cementing Ukraine as a new independent state, with its people largely united in the move towards this. Following this independence, however, would be much like many other post-Soviet states, with a large issue of crime and corruption, with the government being run by an authoritarian leader, Leonid Kuchma. Under his rule, a number of scandals took place, such as that of journalist Georgy Gogansky, who ran Ukrainska Pravda, a website hosting critical news around the Ukrainian government at the time. Georgy was found headless in a shallow grave, following recorded complaints by him about harassment from Ukrainian government security services. His case revealed government collusion in his death and goes greatly into depth into how corrupt Ukraine was at the time, as well as the fiasco of the 2004 election that would lead to the Orange Revolution, where the more authoritarian government supported Yanukovych for the pro-Russian Party of the Regions, against the independent candidate Yushchenko, that stood against the government at the time for its corruption and failure to address Ukraine's economic issues. During the presidential elections in November 21, 2004, this corruption was made clear between the different treatment of Yanukovych, the choice of the authoritarian leader Kuchma, and Yushchenko, where Yushchenko was given nearly no access to media outlets, TV or radio broadcasting, and had to rely upon street performances and concerts, while Yanukovych enjoyed government favour in the media. This concluded with an internationally recognised rigged election, giving Yanukovych a victory over Yushchenko, plunging Ukraine into a political crisis, sparking the Orange Revolution. Eventually, the Ukrainian Supreme Court annulled the official runoff results and ordered a repeat of the second round ballot. The second vote found Yushchenko to be the victor. This would lead to a period of calmness. Ukraine would see some economic growth in this period, as well as some reduction in corruption in the upper levels of government. However, Ukraine would still remain a poor, corrupt nation. Ukraine's economy would still be stagnant compared to its ex-Soviet neighbours that joined the European Union, and unable to take advantage of this, there was a movement within Ukraine to join the European Union. Come 2013, Yanukovych had been elected legitimately this time, with a leading vote of 48.95% compared to 45.47% for Tymoshenko, leading the pro-European party All Ukrainian Union. International observers found this election to be legitimate. However, what would follow would be a massive shift for Ukraine to the very core. In 2013, Yanukovych's government would U-turn on signing the European Union-Ukraine Association Agreement, and instead announcing they would return to focus on trade with Russia, leading to widespread protests on the economic outlook of Ukraine. The agreement was to establish a framework for closer ties between the European Union and Ukraine, and had been agreed to in majority by the Ukrainian parliament. This U-turn was perceived with great dismay by much of the Ukrainian populace and led to peaceful protests on the 21st of November 2013 in Maidan Square. This was the beginning of the Maidan Revolution, that was not yet known at the time. Peaceful protests would go on until the 30th of November, where the Berkut, the Ukrainian riot police, violently dispersed the peaceful protesters. This had the effect of further polarising the Ukrainian people against the government. Following the failure of peaceful protests, riots began the very next day. What would follow was increasingly violent clashes between protesters and government forces such as the Berkut, and eventually would explode into snipers gunning down protesters who were moving towards the Ukrainian parliament, causing nationwide and international outrage. Yanukovych would choose to flee the country to Russia, and as a number of his party members did so too, the party no longer held a majority in the Ukrainian Rada, leading to the parliament voting them out of power and establishing a new interim government with elections to be held in May. Within days of Yanukovych fleeing the country, Russian soldiers appeared in Crimea, which would eventually become the Russian annexation of Crimea. This was the beginning of Russia no longer being a passive threat to Ukraine, through limitation of Ukraine's economical prosperity, through trying to stop Ukraine from growing closer ties to the European Union verbally, and allegedly in regards to supporting more pro-Russian parties within Ukraine, to a physical threat, where Russia actively annexed Ukrainian sovereign territory with no provocation. This would be followed by Russia arming and equipping alleged separatists in East Ukraine to fight a war on Ukrainian soil, with a number of pieces of modern Russian equipment outside of the Ukrainian arsenal being found on the separatist side. Russia became Ukraine's largest threat and cause for suffering once more. This would spark nationalist movements across Ukraine to swell in size and number, as well as the smaller groups that once claimed Russia was a great threat to Ukraine were legitimised by Russia's recent actions. There are a number of claims that the Russian actions were justified due to Ukraine having a Nazi government, and claims that they would ethnically cleanse eastern Ukraine, as well as claims that the revolution was nothing but a Western-backed coup that placed a Nazi government in control of Ukraine. It is therefore time to move on to a brief summary of the structure of the Ukrainian government to examine how much power far-right groups truly held from the revolution to now, as well as the power in Ukraine of groups such as the Azov Battalion and the Right Sector. To counter the claim that the invasion of Ukraine is justified by the existence of Nazism in Ukraine, it's important to make clear to what extent they hold power and influence in the country, and to assess whether or not this level of influence is something that genuinely justifies the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as well as the subsequent death and destruction it caused. First, it is necessary to establish a base understanding of how the Ukrainian government actually works. The Ukrainian government is a republic with a presidential parliament, with both a president and a prime minister, with the government parliament being known as the Verkhovna Rada, or simply Rada. The Rada consists of 450 deputies elected through a system of proportional representation through election. The vote for the president, however, is more akin to first past the post, such as that seen in the United States, India, Singapore, and a number of other countries. This requires at least 225 seats, therefore, to become the leading party. However, coalitions in such government systems can arrive between two parties that represent a majority within Parliament, to ensure a majority of the population has voted for the existing government. This now tells us that any party that isn't in a coalition in the state for an opposition group, or hasn't received 225 seats, holds little to no power. This is why it is important to understand how the Ukrainian government works, before discussing what is the scenario within that government. The current leading party is Zelensky's Servant of the People party, with 239 seats. This party is a centrist, pro-European party, with a mix of liberal, socialist, and elements of libertarianism, which became coined as Ukrainian centrism. This makes up the true leading rule of the Ukrainian government, making Ukraine a centrist state far from Russia's claims of being a Nazi state. The opposition party, which is the second largest party in government, is the liberal conservative European Solidarity Party, with a number of other ideologically similar parties aligned to form the opposition. Ukraine has a number of far-right parties, however not many have won any seats in the Rada. Svoboda became the most successful of them all, and achieved 10.45% in the 2012 parliamentary election pre-revolution. However, following the 2014 election after Maidan, Svoboda only held 6 out of the 450 seats in the Ukrainian Rada, as the largest far-right political group at the time. Fast forward to 2019, and the group would host a coalition of themselves, the National Corps, Right Sector, Azov Battalion, OUN, and the Congress of Ukrainian Nationalists, and will go on to only maintain a single seat in the entire Ukrainian government, a government of which Russia would go on to claim needed denazification, despite how powerless the far right was within the Ukrainian government. It's worth noting that a few Svoboda ministers did hold some office in the interim government immediately following the revolution, but this was all lost in a subsequent election in 2014, and therefore leaving the overwhelming power in Ukraine is held by pro-European centrists. The conclusion on the Ukrainian government is that it was not and is not a Nazi state, and was enacting no policies that had such implication either. With the context of Ukrainian history and an understanding of how Ukraine's government actually works, we are able to analyse the situation of far-right and neo-Nazi groups that operate in the conflict zone and their importance. If Russia's claims of Nazism are to be examined within Ukraine, it is important to both accept where it exists and what it actually causes and what it achieves. After all, what is the use of discussing the existence of Nazis to justify their war without discussing what it is exactly that these Nazis do, and whether their existence in Ukraine justifies Russia's invasion and subsequent death and destruction in Ukraine it caused? We've established that Ukraine is not a Nazi-led or controlled state, but it is now time to acknowledge the existence of neo-Nazi militia groups within Ukraine. Following the revolution, groups such as Azov and the Right Sector established militias following the separatists in Donbass taking up arms against Ukraine. These militia forces were notorious for donning a multitude of symbols that referenced and represented Nazism or Ukrainian Nazi sympathisers in World War II, echoing the nationalist resistance to Russia once more. These groups were going to fight effectively against the separatists, with Azov retaking Mariupol, leading to a niche but strong support base for these groups, as the Ukrainian military at the time was a shell of what it is today following the great humiliation of Crimea. Internationally, there would be a spotlight on these groups and their symbolism via a plethora of media outlets. It was no secret that neo-Nazis were being used as cannon fodder by the Ukrainian government. However, what is notable is that the ideology of these men was confined to themselves. The Ukrainian government may have used these men to feed into their war in the east, but they in no way gained political power or control over Ukraine. The Ukrainian government would instead gain control over them. Many groups would be taken over by the Ukrainian military as time went on, with Azov becoming a regiment of the Ukrainian National Guard. With a change of leadership, they maintained control over them. This was similar to many of the militias that arose during 2014 and onwards. However, the Ukrainian government would always struggle to completely eradicate far-right and nationalist symbols in these groups. To what extent they thought doing so was a priority is only truly known within the Ukrainian government, and it is fair and necessary to criticise these symbols whenever they appear, for no modern military should be allowing such symbols to be displayed. With that out the way, however, I cannot for 1 second take the denazification claim by Russia seriously for a multitude of reasons. Firstly, these groups were grunts that fought and died at the orders of the government. While they may bear such symbols and convince themselves that is what they fight for, the reality is much different. They would go on to fight for a Jewish-led, liberal, centrist European government, which couldn't be further from what Nazism truly stood for. While the symbols represent evil, the use of them alone is not akin to enacting the evils committed by those whom such symbols represent. Much like the use of the Soviet flag by Russians during the invasion did not mean they were bringing communism to Ukraine or supporting Holodomor. It is also a fact that Ukraine was not a Nazi state, whether the likes of Azov wished it was or not. Secondly, the sin of wearing such symbols pales in comparison to the sin of starting an invasion that would lead to the death of around 100,000 people, with widespread destruction, 7 million refugees and more. It seems almost laughable that the wearing of symbols in a conflict zone that Russia itself fueled was fair justification for causing so much death and destruction. If the moral argument is fairly used, it makes little sense to use a moral dilemma to act far more immoral. The Russian invasion will go on to ruin far more lives than Azov did for 8 years in Donbass. And with this clear disparity in which issue caused far more suffering, it becomes illogical to come to the conclusion that Russia invaded Ukraine to denazify it, or that in any way justifies Russia's choice to go to war with Ukraine, with no Nazi government and at very best some soldiers LARPing in a war zone. Thirdly, following the fall of Mariupol, Russia captured a large number of Azov fighters, and they would soon show how important denazification was. Russia often touted that the Nazis of Azov would be put on trial, and there would be genuine denazification. Instead of this, however, the Azov members captured were given back to Ukraine eagerly. Russia would trade them for Viktor Medvedchuk, a pro-Russian oligarch. While Azov indeed had Nazi elements, and even does at this point, it shows the reality of the situation was that Russia simply didn't care. They made it clear that Ukrainian nationalists were an afterthought, and they would happily drop denazification when it was convenient to them. Fourthly, after Ukraine had Nazi collaborators in the 1940s, it would have the Soviet Union take over Ukraine once more and spend 70 years pushing communism and the evils of fascism, and if that didn't eradicate the existence of neo-Nazis in Ukraine, what is to imply that Russia's invasion would be any better? If the Soviets couldn't quell this after a near-century control over Ukraine, it seems almost illogical to come to the conclusion that Russia can change it any more. which is even more ironic going into the final point. Lastly, the entire premise of the invasion being justified due to Ukrainian soldiers wearing far-right, nationalist and Nazi symbols makes even less sense when we look at Russia's same use of nationalists and neo-Nazis when convenient, completely debunking any last ounce of credibility of this claim of denazifying Ukraine. Dmitry Utkin is a commonly known Russian Nazi with Waffen SS tattoos on his neck, who was a lieutenant colonel in the Russian military, as well as going on to be a high-ranking member of the Russian government-funded Wagner Group. Wagner will become notorious for their issue of Nazism, as well as other far-right groups such as the Russian Imperial Legion and the Russisch militia. There is clear support for these groups in the pro-Russian circle, as many pro-Russian telegrams such as Intel Slava Z, touted as one of the largest pro-Russian telegram channels in English with the claim that it is funded by the Kremlin, will often forward the likes of Right People Z, a far-right Russian telegram channel that parrots a common Russian message that Russia is fighting for the white race and to prevent the quote-unquote liberal Jewish Western homosexuality. In conclusion, the claim that Russia was justified to invade Ukraine on the basis of denazification is an easy claim to debunk with the previously listed rebuttals. At very best, Nazism was an issue among a number of Eastern European nations, including Ukraine and Russia, that does need to be addressed. However, in no way is the issue in Ukraine close to being such a problem that it warrants a war that leads to hundreds of thousands of deaths and mass destruction across Ukraine, whilst failing to even denazify the country, freeing Nazis when convenient to Putin. So to conclude this video, it's clear that Russia doesn't truly care to denazify Ukraine, and also has their own degree of Nazism within, as well as far-right white supremacists and nationalists. The notion that Ukraine is a Nazi state can therefore be considered nothing but debunked Russian propaganda to justify their imperialist war to grab land in Ukraine, causing large-scale death and destruction to the Ukrainian people once more. There is no sound logic following this analysis that Russia's claim of denazification is a legitimate excuse for their invasion, and is nothing but a cold lie to fool people into supporting them as a force of good, and so that Russia's online supporters can spread the message that arming Ukraine is arming Nazis, so that aid stops to Ukraine, and Russia can achieve its imperialist, expansionist goals without Ukraine standing in their way. Ukraine is therefore not a Nazi state, and Ukraine's nationalist situation doesn't come close to justifying the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's all for this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you think I missed anything or want me to address any points, feel free to drop a comment and I will happily address it. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. And lastly, next time someone tells you that Ukraine is a Nazi state, you can send them this video to save you the effort of dealing with them. I'll see you in the next video, guys. Kubota out.